This is the American Serengeti, the inland waters of the Pacific Northwest, from the Queen Charlotte and Johnson Straits to Puget Sound. Beneath the surface lies a world of great mystery. In these murky waters, wild salmon fulfill their miracle life cycles. Seals and sea lions sail through as if on air. And the most powerful predator the ocean has ever seen, the orca or killer whale, reigns supreme. This underwater epic is 10,000 years old and seldom seen by the millions who now line these shores. Will the epic continue forever? What part will we now play in all of this? I'm Jean-Michel Cousteau. Join us as we explore the inland sea.
I got into diving when my kids were in high school. I've been diving for 20 years, and I see above and below the surface, and it's a world. It's a world. I suppose it's like astronauts going into outer space because they're looking back on the whole world, and they're out there where there's nothing.
Over the last 20 years, I've been doing a lot of studies in Puget Sound, and I'm on the water just about every weekend or every other weekend throughout the year. And I use a lot of different techniques to make those studies. We will use beach seines right along the shore to look at the fish living right here in the eelgrass bed, or we use bottom trawls, nets that scoop up fish along the bottom or maybe up in the water column. But we also do things like scuba diving. We do that in a very scientific manner. We're counting fish and measuring fish and identifying all the critters that live along certain areas in Puget Sound. That's really enjoyable for me to do that kind of work, but it's also provided me an opportunity over those 20 years to see the last of the good old days and see how fish populations have changed.
I dive on a place on Vashon Island because I lived there, and we used to have cabezon, and we used to have greenlings, and we used to have crab. And in the 20 years that we've been diving that site, there are very few crab left. There's no cabezon left. There's no true cod. Haven't seen a true cod in years. Even the piling perch and the little tiny, they call them shiner perch, and they swim in huge schools. Well, the fishermen jig them, and they'll take home a bucket full. Pretty soon there aren't going to be any of those left.
And each one of those species, they do something different in the environment. They all have their unique role. So we're just starting to uncover the complexity of how those animals make their living and their importance in the environment that's tied together.
Up until a few years ago, the seas around us provided what seemed like an unlimited bounty in food. Purse seiners and gill netters used to set their nets for prize salmon returning to their natal streams. Youngsters and adults cast their lines and told stories of the big ones they caught and the ones that got away. When salmon were not running, commercial and sport fishers caught codfish and bottomfish. It was unthinkable that they become scarce, but the unthinkable has happened. Throughout the world, fisheries are being depleted. And sadly, the decline and extension of fish and fishing is happening in the inland sea. To some, this isn't news. People here know the plight of salmon and what must be done for their recovery. But many of the inland sea's other fish, its herring, codfish, rockfish, once abundant and healthy, are also on the verge of extinction. What happened to our fish? Is the inland sea becoming the Dead Sea? I'm Jean-Michel Cousteau. As a lifelong diver, I've explored many of the world's oceans, but sometimes the important thing is what's not seen beneath the surface, the depletion of fisheries throughout the marine world. Fish are disappearing fast, and in the vast inland sea, the problem is now a crisis. Bottom fish, herring, salmon, all vanishing, impacting the entire food chain, from the harbor seals and sea lions, all the way up to Orcinus orca, the killer whale. Salmon is the undisputed king of Puget Sound, but native salmon are now listed under the Endangered Species Act because almost too late, we're beginning to understand the mistakes we've made. We've managed the harvesting poorly. We've relied too heavily on hatcheries. We've dammed the rivers, paved the floodplains, developed the shorelines, dredged the estuaries, and we continue to discharge poisonous chemicals into the bays and rivers. Other marine fish have declined for many of the same reasons. Herring, an important link in the food chain. They lay their eggs in eelgrass, which used to grow abundantly along the intertidal area of Puget Sound. But these areas have been dredged for ports and marinas or altered by housing. The nurseries of the inland sea have been replaced by docks, bulkheads, and concrete, and contaminated by industries.
In middle 70s, when I started to study the toxins, we used actually Puget Sound as our laboratory. And we discovered that there in Puget Sound, there were some sites that were quite contaminated, where those chemicals were causing a number of types of effects, all the way from liver tumors to reproductive impairment to immune system problems. And we studied bottom fish. The reason for studying them was that they don't move about too much, that they are going to be the most exposed to the chemicals that are settling down. And they are at the bottom where many of those chemicals that don't get oxidized quickly or don't get changed end up. So they are actually sitting on the sink, the contaminant toxin sink, so to speak, if the areas are contaminated.
We found that rockfish have a lot of characteristics that are almost like humans. They live long. They live about as long as we do. Some live over 100 years like humans. And they have the opportunity to accumulate some of these toxins that just are very persistent in the environment, like PCBs or mercury. Some is natural, some is not. But the long-lived fishes, especially the male rockfish, seem to accumulate high levels of these toxic compounds.
We have problems with contaminated sediments in our urban harbors. Every one of our urban harbors has either state-mandated or federal-mandated cleanup of contaminated sediments. And these contaminants seem to be getting into the food web and causing problems. And all of these factors add up to an unhealthy ecosystem, or an ecosystem that's in danger.
Fishing is a cultural way of life for our people. It's a big part of the tribe's diet. You know, we're getting a larger percentage of our tribal population getting cancer than we had 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And that's probably part of the problem.
We understand chemotherapy, we understand something radiation, we understand most everything that affects us when it affects us. We don't see the problem in our waters as something that affects us personally. We don't first of all see the contamination because water looks clean, but people know now how many places we can't swim anymore. People are beginning to know. I think there has to be a systematic way of showing people that if we don't keep it clean, we don't make an effort to restore the waters, that it is eventually going to affect our health, our freedom, our privileges.
Rockfish are really unique. There are over 70 species that live along our coast. In Puget Sound, we don't get all of those species. We get about 20 of them, and 5 most commonly. But we found that rockfish almost like humans. They give birth to live young. To some extent, the mother rockfish will give nourishment to their young. And they're homebodies. For some of the species of rockfish that we call sedentary, they really are. Once they find a good home, they stick to it. And you might only find them within a couple square yards of their favorite rock. And we've tagged these critters, and we've actually tricked them. We've moved them away to see how far they can go and then come back to home. And we found that the majority of them actually can go up to 4 miles away and then find their way back home, almost to their exact same rock. And that's just really quite astounding. It is profound, and you think about how we try to manage these species. I'm maybe midway in my career here, and my career might only span the life of one rockfish. It may only be half of a rockfish's life. So when you start to try to manage these populations, you really have to put it into that context, let alone how many different political regimes we'll go through and economic regimes. These fish have evolved a strategy to not just survive from one year to the next, but they've evolved a strategy to live over 60 years, 6 decades, through El Niños, through good periods of production and poor periods of production. And they may only have a successful spawning year once every 10 or 20 years. So they really have a different strategy than making their livings. Bottomfish populations are so important to the cycle of production here in Puget Sound. The marine mammals like seals and sea lions, they're feeding primarily on bottomfish, not salmon. Bottomfish, cod, herring, and pollock, and whiting, all those bottomfish species are really their #1 prey items. Salmon usually come down in 4th or lower on the list. They are primarily feeding on bottomfish. So if those populations aren't doing well, then the seals and sea lion populations aren't going to be doing well. There's one study that they found that Dall's porpoises feed on a little critter that lives on the bottom called the black-bellied eelpout. They found hundreds of the ear bones of this little bottomfish in them. We know virtually nothing about that species of eelpout. And we're starting to learn that some of the orcas and whales will also feed on some of these bottomfish too. So it starts to build up the chain, and then of course humans will enter in that chain at the top. So we have over 200 species of saltwater fish that live here in Puget Sound, and along the coast of Washington even more. So we have a rather diverse fauna. Just looking at them, they're beautiful animals. We have sculpins that people call bullheads, and there's over 30 kinds of sculpins in Puget Sound. So there's complexity out there, and all these links are going on. They're providing this base of production, and this biological diversity and naturalness of our environment here in Puget Sound.